Hello everyone, I'm Bubbles from Susan's family. Today, I will introduce to you the Animism series butterfly shade pullover. This pullover is divided into front pieces, back piece, sleeves and drawstrings. First, knit the front and back pieces separately. Then knit the sleeves and attach them. Finally, make the drawstrings. The pullover comes in two sizes. The knit method for different sizes is roughly the same, but the stitch count and row count vary. This tutorial will demonstrate using the smaller size as an example. It's important to note that, due to individual differences in knit tension, the size of the fabric pieces may differ. Before starting the actual knitting, it's a good idea to make a gauge sample to measure your tension. After measuring, follow the instructions in the video to adjust and then continue knitting. Start with the front piece, which is divided into the hem, body, and shoulder parts. Begin by knitting the hem. Then work upwards from the hem to knit the body and shoulder parts. The hem is worked using the cable cast-on method. Knitted back and forth. The stitch techniques used include purl and knit stitches. Now, let's take a look at the chart next. One square on the chart represents one stitch. This corresponds to one loop in your knit. Here, different symbols correspond to the required stitch techniques. The chart will have corresponding markings for these. Cluster stitches are all represented within one square. This indicates the cast-on method and the number of chains. When counting the number of stitches per row, just count the number of squares, then match it with the number of loops on your knitting needle. Arrows indicate the direction of work. The right side is always read from right to left on the chart. The wrong side is read from left to right on the chart. Pay attention when working the wrong side. You need to work the opposite stitch pattern as shown on the chart. That's the basic introduction to reading the chart. Take the corresponding yarn. Start with a knit stitch while casting on. Make a slip knot. Place it on the knitting needle. This is the first stitch. This is the second stitch. Continue casting on the corresponding number of stitches. Refer to the chart for the exact number of stitches. After casting on the correct number of stitches, the cast-on is complete. Note that my sample has fewer stitches. Treat the cast-on row as the right side. Now, let's start working on row 1. Refer to the chart. This row is all purl stitches. Since you are working it on the wrong side, you need to use the opposite stitch pattern from the chart. So, knit all stitches. Complete this row. Once done, the first row is completed. Next, let's work on row 2. This row is worked on the right side. Turn your work first. Refer to the chart. Work knit stitches. Complete this row. Once done, the second row is completed. Now, let's start working on row 3. Turn your work again. This row is worked on the wrong side. Complete this row. Once done, the third row is completed. That concludes the hem section. Next, let's move on to the body. Continue knitting upwards from the hem. The new stitch used include yarn over, K2 tog, left slant decrease, SPO, right slant decrease, and center double decrease. Now, let's show. Let's start with row 1. Refer to the chart. First, knit the corresponding number of knit stitches. Here, I'm working on a small sample, so the stitch count is smaller. Next, work a K2 tog, left slant decrease. Insert the right needle into the first 2 loops on the left needle, and knit 1 stitch. That completes the K2 tog. Then, work a yarn over, bring the yarn from front to back over the right needle. That completes the yarn over. Next, refer to the chart. Continue knitting until you reach the position for the SPO, right slant decrease. When you reach the corresponding position, work a SPO. First, slip 1 stitch as if to knit, then pass it over the next stitch, knit 1 stitch. And finally, pick up the slipped stitch with the left needle. Pass the slipped stitch over the left stitch and drop it. That completes the SPO, right slant decrease. Next, continue following the stitch pattern on the chart. Complete this row. That finishes the first row. Now let's work the second row. Turn your work. We will work this row on the wrong side, which means working purl stitches. When you reach the yarn over, just continue with purl stitch. Complete this row. That finishes the second row. Next, continue to refer to the chart and work all the way through row 6. All the stitch techniques used have been demonstrated before. Just follow the chart for stitching. Pay attention to those colored blocks and knit corresponding stitches. Now, let's work on row 7. Referring to the chart, start by knitting up to the point just before the 3 stitches combined into one. When you reach the corresponding position, knit the 3 stitches together into one. At the same time, slip the next 2 stitches on the left side using a knit stitch. Then, knit 1 stitch. Next, pick up the 2 unworked stitches with the left needle. Pass them over the stitch on the left and slip them off. This completes the 3 stitches knitted together into one. Next, continue to refer to the chart and complete this row. After finishing, row 7 will be completed. Let's take a look. By using different stitch techniques, we form the corresponding pattern. Next, everyone refers to the chart and completes the corresponding row numbers for the body. The method and stitch techniques have been demonstrated before. This concludes the explanation of the body. Next, let's learn how to knit the shoulder parts. It is divided into the left shoulder part and the right shoulder part, distinguished by how it would look when actually worn. Continuing from the bodice yarn tail, start knitting the left shoulder part. Now, let's show. I will continue to demonstrate using a sample. I won't be knitting the corresponding stitch patterns. Instead, I will use knit stitches for everything. You should actually follow the stitch patterns on the chart. Here, I will only demonstrate the method. First, refer to the pattern and knit the corresponding stitches. Leave the remaining loops unworked. This completes the first row. Next, let's work the second row. Turn your work first. This row is worked on the wrong side again. Complete this row. This completes the second row. Next, continue to follow the chart for knitting. For the following rows, you need to bind off stitches at the neckline to form the neck opening. For the shoulders, work short rows to create the sloping shoulder shape. Let's first learn how to shape the neck opening. According to the chart, you can use stitch markers to separate the stitches that need to be bound off. If you don't have stitch markers, you can also use paper clips or safety pins as alternatives. My sample will only demonstrate the method. First, slip the first stitch to the right needle. Then work one purl stitch. Next, pass the next stitch over the previous one. Which also decreases one stitch. Continue to decrease the second stitch. Work one purl stitch. Pass the next stitch over the previous one. This completes the decrease of the second stitch. Continue with this method to decrease the corresponding number of stitches. There will be one stitch remaining on the right side of the stitch marker, which is the last stitch that needs to be decreased. Work one more purl stitch and then decrease it. This completes the decreases for this row. Continue referring to the chart and finish this row. After completing it, continue following the chart to finish the left shoulder part. When decreasing later, handle the edge stitch, using this method as well. When you reach the column with yarn over in different colors, you need to undo the stitches before this column. Then unravel them one by one. Let me demonstrate the method now. First, learn the technique, and then apply it when you reach the corresponding position. Before starting, you can also use a stitch marker. Place a marker on the right side of this stitch. Then knit until you reach just before the stitch marker. When you reach the corresponding position, loosen this stitch. And then make one more yarn over, finish the last few stitches. And then unravel the loops in this column one by one. Next, you need to work short rows on the other side to form the sloping shoulder. After completing everything, hold the stitches on the straight needle. Here's the method for working short rows and holding stitches. Learn the method before you start knitting. For short rows with stitches left on the right side, you can see that 6 rows need to be worked here. The first row is worked on the wrong side, leaving the last 5 stitches unworked at the end. I have already completed this. The second row is worked on the right side, starting with making a yarn over on the right needle like this. Then work 1 slip stitch. Next, knit each stitch correspondingly. Complete this row. After completing it, continue with the third row. At the end of this row, besides the initial 5 stitches, leave 4 more stitches unworked. Note: the yarn over is not included in this count. After completing it, continue with the fourth row. The method is identical to the second row. Start by yarn over like this. Then work 1 slip stitch. Next, follow the chart to complete this row as usual. For the upcoming 5th row, leave 4 stitches unworked at the end. Similarly, the yarn over is not included in this count. The 6th row is also worked in the same way as the second row. I will continue to complete these 2 rows. Now, I have finished the short rows. Finally, one more row needs to be worked. To pick up the yarn overs, start by working into each stitch in sequence with purl stitches, continuing until the stitch before the yarn over. After completing it, first, switch the yarn over with the stitch on its left. Then work them together as one purl stitch. Each time you reach the position of the yarn over, you should switch the yarn over with the stitch on its left first. Then work them together as a purl stitch. Continue to finish this row. Now, we have finished picking up the yarn overs. Let's take a look at how the right side looks. This is the effect on the wrong side. Next, I will demonstrate the method to hold stitches. After completing one side, transfer the loops to a separate straight needle or circular needle. You can also thread them with yarn. When you continue knitting later, put them back onto the needle. Thread from right to left. This is how you hold your stitches. That concludes the left shoulder part. Now let's learn how to knit the right shoulder part. Here you need to attach the yarn again, then continue knitting. You can wind the ball of yarn to match the color segment of the left shoulder part before knitting. Or you can knit with the corresponding color segment based on your preference. Now, let's show. Here I will continue demonstrating with a small sample. First, join the yarn. Make a slip knot with the yarn. Then insert it into the first stitch. Pick up the loop. Continue knitting according to the chart. After completing this, the first row of the right shoulder part will be done. Next, everyone continue following the stitch pattern on the chart to knit. When you reach the later rows, you also need to bind off stitches on one side to form the neck. On the other side, knit short rows to form the sloping shoulder. And you need to loosen the loops corresponding to the column of stitches that are left hanging. Here I will first demonstrate the method for shaping the neckline. First, separate the loops that need to be bound off. Then slip the edge stitch. Next, knit one stitch. Then pass the previous stitch over the next one. Continue knitting and binding off stitches at the same time. After binding off the corresponding number of stitches, finish knitting the remaining stitches. Once completed, continue to knit the remaining rows. For the following rows, refer to the chart to shape the neck opening, and knit short rows. After completing this section, fasten off the loops. The method to fasten off is the same as before. Now, I'll show you how to knit the short rows on this side. For the short rows starting from the left side, you can see that 6 rows need to be worked as short rows here. The first row is worked on the right side, leaving the last 5 stitches unworked at the end. I have already completed this row. The second row is worked on the wrong side. Starting with yarn over on the right needle like this. Make sure not to yarn over too loosely. Then work one slip stitch. Next, work into each stitch in sequence with purl stitches. Finish this row. Once completed, continue with the third row. For this row, besides leaving the initial 5 stitches unworked at the end, you also need to leave another 4 stitches unworked. Pay attention, this yarn over is not included in the count. Once completed, continue with the fourth row. The method is identical to the second row. Start by making one yarn over like this. Then work one slip stitch. Next, follow the chart to complete this row as usual. For the upcoming fifth row, you need to leave another 4 stitches unworked at the end. Similarly, the yarn over is not counted. The sixth row is also worked in the same way as the second row. I will continue to finish these 2 rows. Now, I have completed the short rows. Finally, one more row needs to be worked. To pick up the yarn overs, start by knitting each stitch correspondingly, continuing until the stitch before the yarn over. After completing, combine the yarn over with the next stitch on the left and knit them together as one knit stitch. Each time you reach the position of the yarn over, continue to combine the yarn over with the next stitch on the left and knit them together. Continue to finish this row. Now, finish picking up the wrap stitches. You can take a look. This is how the right side looks like. This is how the wrong side looks like. Sometimes, to make the row counts match on both sides, you need to knit one more row. Follow the chart instructions specifically for this. That concludes the right shoulder part. Up to this point, we have covered the entire front piece. Next, let's learn about the back piece. It also consists of the hem, body, and shoulder parts. The knitting method is almost the same as the front piece. The only difference is in shaping the neck opening. After joining the yarn for the left shoulder part, you start decreasing. The method of joining the yarn is identical to that of the front piece. After joining the yarn, follow the chart for knitting. Note that after completing one side of the back shoulder part, you need to match and bind off together with the corresponding shoulder part of the front piece. Below, I will provide a method for binding off together. First, let's learn the technique, and then apply it while knitting. The first method is stitch-to-stitch connection. This method is commonly used when both pieces are in a loop state. It's a frequently used joining technique. It involves binding off together to join the fabric pieces. It's typically used for connecting the shoulders of front and back pieces. Both pieces are in a loop state. We will consider the stockinette stitch side as the right side. Binding off together is usually done on the wrong side of the fabric. This means you need to place the two pieces with their right sides facing each other. Typically, one of the pieces remains uncut, continuing the yarn. Regardless of which piece the yarn is on, place the side with the yarn tail on the right. When binding off together, you usually bind off while knitting the stitches. This means passing through loops from both pieces simultaneously. You knit and bind off the stitches together. The stitch count for both pieces is usually the same, so you can knit and bind off corresponding stitches one by one. If one piece has more stitches, you need to decrease while binding off on the side with more stitches. If this piece has more stitches, you can insert through two loops at once. Then continue by inserting through one loop. and knit to bind off. If the other piece has more stitches, insert through 2 loops from that piece at once, and knit to bind off. In my case, both pieces have the same stitch count, so I will continue binding them off. Then tie off and hide the yarn tail. This is the effect after combining and binding off the stitches. Up to this point, the back piece has been fully explained. Next, we will work on the sleeves. The method for knitting the sleeves is almost identical to that of the front and back pieces. Just follow the chart for the stitch pattern. After completing all sections, bind off while knitting the edge stitches. Here, knit the edge stitch normally. After completing the knitting, first use the row-to-row sewing method to sew the sleeve pieces together. Then, use the stitch-to-row sewing method to sew the sleeve bind-off edge to the front and back pieces. Before sewing, locate the side to be sewn. Fold it neatly and lay it flat, positioning the seam at the underarm. And then start sewing. After finishing the sleeve seams, don't forget to sew the side seams of the front and back pieces. This also uses the row-to-row sewing method. Let's first learn the sewing technique. Now, let's learn how to connect rows to rows. We usually use the invisible seam method for this. When sewing, pick up the horizontal strands along the edges of the 2 edge stitches. Let's start by getting familiar with the fabric piece. First, locate the first stitch at the edge. The first stitch at the edge usually has 4 different scenarios. The first scenario is a slip stitch. This means you pick up along the texture without knitting, forming a large braid. The second scenario is also a slip stitch. But when making the slip stitch, it goes against the texture below, forming this type of knot. The third scenario is knitting every row, typically knitting on the right side, and purl on the wrong side, forming this type of small braid. The fourth scenario is also knitting every row, typically knitting on both the right and wrong sides, forming a washboard stitch. The second stitch is right next to the first stitch on its left. For example, in this piece, from this side, the second stitch shows the knit texture, and from the other side, the second stitch shows the purl texture. Whether the second stitch shows the knit texture or the purl texture, you can notice that the loops are all oriented correctly. these reversed loops with the horizontal bars below are the horizontal strands between two stitches. The same applies to this side. This is a reversed loop. This horizontal bar is the horizontal strand between two stitches. The edge worked in seed stitch follows the same principle. This is the second stitch. This column here is the second stitch, with correctly oriented loops. Between these two stitches, there is a reversed loop. This line here is the horizontal strand between two stitches. The edges are worked with slip stitches. Similarly, between these two stitches, there is also a horizontal strand. No matter which type, each strand roughly corresponds to one row. Before sewing, you can weave in the yarn tails on the wrong side with a few stitches, and secure them with a knot. I won't weave in them here for demonstration. Seamless sewing means alternating between these two fabric pieces, picking up the horizontal strands along the edges of the two edge stitches. For sewing, pick up 1-2 strands each time. Note, if the row counts match, you can sew them together correspondingly. This means picking up the same number of strands each time. Always insert the needle where you last pulled out. To pick up the horizontal strand, here, I pick up 1 strand each time. Sew a few stitches, and slightly tighten. If the row counts differ between the two pieces, but you want to sew them together evenly, you can pick up more strands on the side with more rows. For example, overall, you would still pick up 1 strand each time, but adjust as needed for evenness. On the side with more rows, you can, at appropriate positions, pick up 2 strands. Here, the row counts of the two pieces are identical, so I will continue sewing to finish. This is the method for seamless sewing of rows. This is how you handle it if the stitches are bound off. If the stitches are in a bound off state, they need to be sewn along with the rows. On this side of the needle, pick up the reversed braid. On this side of the row, pick up the horizontal strand. And if the row count exceeds the stitch count, adjust accordingly, at appropriate positions, picking up two horizontal strands simultaneously. If you don't need to sew a braid effect, just pull the yarn tight. Up to this point, the explanation of knitting the sleeves is now complete. Finally, we will knit the drawstrings. There are two identical ones. Start by knitting, and then sew them onto both sides of the front neckline. Now, let's show the demonstration. Refer to the pattern. First, knit the chains forming the foundation chain to the corresponding length. The specific length can be referred to in the pattern. You can also knit according to your own preference. After knitting, leave a long yarn tail, and cut the yarn. Note that my swatch has fewer stitches. Next thread, the reserved yarn tail through a darning needle. Then sew it onto one side of the neckline. The sewing method is not fixed, just make sure it's secure. Sew 2 stitches and tie a knot to secure it. Then hide the yarn tail on the wrong side. Also hide the starting yarn tail. This completes one side of the drawstring. Make the other side using the same method. Finally, tie the drawstring into a bow. That concludes the instructions for the drawstring. This completes the entire piece of clothing. If you have any unclear parts during the knitting process, don't hesitate to join our Facebook group to get supports. Susan's family. Support your handwork experience. Enjoy the joy of life. Thanks for watching. See you in the next episode.